Welcome, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are today. I'm Emily Cottrell from NISTS, and welcome to today's webinar, Boosting Student Success through Quality, Well-Supported, and Affordable Transfer Pathways. We're so glad you could join us, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters very, very shortly. We're so excited to have with us Amanda Janice Robertson from IHEP and Rochelle Sharp from HCM Strategists. They're going to talk to us about this wonderful initiative, TransferBOOST, and give us all the details and takeaways that we can have on that. So we're going to get to them in just a moment quickly, I promise. But just in case anyone is new to NISTS, we're going to give you a quick introduction. Welcome on behalf of all of us on the team here. But if you aren't familiar with our organization, we are a professional development org in higher ed, and our sole mission is transfer student success. So we work with professional faculty administrators. We want to help people be transfer champions who partner together to challenge inequitable systems and transform the transfer student experiences. So we're excited about today's topic because it is right in line with what we want to help everyone become more comfortable with as they're doing their work to support transfer student success. So I want to cover just a couple of ground rules as we go into the webinar. At this point, I'm sure you've been in a million webinars, but just a couple of things to be sure we're all on the same page. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes with the presenters, a formal presentation, but we have reserved about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. We ask that you do use the Zoom QA box to insert your questions. You can do that anonymously if you're most comfortable, or leave your name, whichever. We'll be monitoring that behind the scenes, so please feel free to do that. We'll answer them as they come up, but we also have that dedicated time at the end. So again, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A. We may share some links with you in the chat box, so keep an eye out for those as well. This is being recorded. We're live in June 2023, so we will send you the link to the recording probably early next week. It takes me a little bit to get it all edited and uploaded to YouTube and all that good stuff, but just watch your email. I'm going to send you along all the links and the video for that, so keep an eye out. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. And y'all asked such great questions on the registration form, literally hundreds of questions. There's no way we can get to all of them, but we're going to do our best. Know, though, that there's lots of extra resources, particularly that really specific stuff on our website, NISTS.org. We've got something called the Knowledge Center where you can find our guides and resources, including this from IHEP. We link to not only the stuff that we create, but other great research that's going on in the field. So check that out. We've also got something called our conference archives, and that's where you can dig in the literal slides and handouts and presentations from the last 3 years of conferences to see what your transfer peers are up to across the country. And they've got lots of great ideas that you can begin to implement. But again, I don't want to take up a lot of time. I'm going to hand it straight over to our speakers. I'm sure they've got all the time they need to cover this great content. So thank you. Welcome. Buckle up. It's going to be a fun conversation. We're so glad to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over. So let's get started. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you so much, everyone, for having us today. We're really excited to speak with you all about our TransferBOOST project. As Emily said, my name is Amanda Janice Robertson. I'm representing the Institute for Higher Education Policy, or IHEP, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit research, policy, and advocacy organization committed to promoting post-secondary access and success for all students, regardless of race, background, and circumstance. And I'll hand it to my colleague, Rochelle, to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Rochelle Sharp, Director with HCM Strategists. We are an education policy consulting firm, and we were thrilled to support IHEP as the technical assistance providers in TransferBOOST. Excited to talk with you about it today.
And so today, as Emily said, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to provide an overview of the project, and Rochelle will share some lessons learned, and then we'll talk about some of the resources that are available from this work. Next slide. So our aim here with TransferBOOST was really at its core to dismantle barriers to success and address inequities that are persistent in transfer. And IHEP and HCM Strategists partnered with 24 institutions in Arizona, Illinois, and Virginia to lead TransferBOOST. BOOST, which stands for Bachelor's Opportunity Options that are straightforward and transparent. And this is a multi-year initiative designed to provide students with affordable, quality, and well-supported 2 to 4 year degree pathways. I'll talk a little bit about the selection of the states. They were selected based on a couple of different criteria. So first was diverse student enrollment. States needed to serve a high proportion of adults from low-income backgrounds and students of color across public higher education systems. Participating institutions needed to serve at least 20% of the state's Black, Latinx, or Hispanic, Indigenous, and underserved Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander populations. Second was state level readiness. States needed key policy infrastructure in areas like need-based aid, baseline transfer articulation policies, and student success funding, as well as statewide dashboards and communications capacity that could be leveraged to build public awareness around the initiative. The third criteria was regional and local readiness. States needed to have one or more regions where addressing equity gaps would have a statewide impact. And these regions needed to have institutional leaders, community-based organizations, and advocacy groups that were willing to engage with students and communities of color and deliver on transfer commitments. And then finally, we looked at institutional readiness. States needed to have institutional leaders who were deeply committed to revisiting their business models to better serve adults from low-income backgrounds and students of color in this post-COVID context. Next slide. And then the institutions themselves were also selected in unique ways for each state's context, because we want to meet the states where they are as well. So in Arizona, TransferBOOST focused on a single partnership. With the size and diversity of Maricopa Community College's student body, along with some work that was already in development with Northern Arizona University, it led to sort of a perfect storm, perfect place to explore the importance of transfer students across and between the two campuses. In Illinois, we had really deep engagement with two higher education governance agencies, the Illinois Board of Higher Education and the Illinois Community College Board, and they really enthusiastically wanted to provide leadership on TransferBOOST. And so they did some digging into their data, their outcomes data, thinking about state policies, and ultimately identified 3 four-year institutions and 5 community colleges who work together to articulate transferability of workforce programs, examine ROI, and affordability improvements, expand joint student supports, and think about new ways to reach current and prospective transfer students. And then finally, in Virginia, the State Higher Education Agency, the State Council on Higher Education in Virginia, was also deeply engaged, and they convened the institutions as well as a steering committee. And they explored improvements to critical policies like their transfer scholarship, the transfer navigation portal, and the G3 workforce funding in community colleges. Institutional partners included 6 universities and 8 community colleges who explored high demand pathways, developed improvement to affordability, recommended changes to the transfer portal, and explored expansion of state funded financial aid. And so all in all, from this engagement, we know that when transfer pathways are done right with equity, affordability, and students in mind, they can serve students really well. And as part of this project, participating institutions received facilitation, coordination, and support from national experts as they explored and created these transfer pathways. And there were really 4 components to our approach. First was ensuring that all credits transfer and apply seamlessly, because we know that nationally 43% of credits are lost nationwide through the transfer process. And knowing that we want students today to make a good use of their time and their money, TransferBOOST really sought to ensure that the credits transfer and apply seamlessly from the 2 to the 4 year. The second tenet was providing clear costs. We know that students can address financial barriers when they know costs along the entire pathway, including non-tuition costs, and thinking about the role of scholarships and financial aid. So part of our initiative was really focused on providing clear information on costs and the role of this financial aid. Our third tenet was to streamline time to degree. Institutions that participated in TransferBOOST work to streamline time to degree from the 2 to 4 year institutions and offer some wraparound supports to help students to complete both the associate's and the bachelor's degrees in a timely manner. And then fourth, and super important, is communicating clearly with students. Research really demonstrates that clear information about transfer pathways and their costs can help students complete their credential. And TransferBOOST institutions developed clear, consistent, and direct messaging to help students and ensure awareness of and participation in the degree pathway. Next slide, please. And so coming out of these 2 years of work, we have a few lessons learned that really fall into 4 categories. First is partnerships. So thinking about robust engagement of 2- and 4-year partners, as well as states, and partnerships within campuses as well, and expanding that awareness. Second are pathways. So seeking to align goals, identify existing transfer pathways, and identify high value transfer pathways. Third is price. Financial modeling was a key part of our work with the states and institutions to help them determine an affordability approach and establish a sustainable cost structure. And then finally is promotion, how they advertise the pathway, how they're recruiting students in a joint manner, and how they're executing those support plans. So I'm actually going to pass the mic now to my colleague, Rochelle, who's going to share out a bit more information on those 4 Ps.
Great, thank you, Amanda. As Amanda said, I will go through each of those areas and share examples from each of the 3 states that illuminate the lessons learned in this across this initiative. We all know the adage that we are stronger together, and partnerships really emerged as a strong thread throughout the initiative that really emphasize the importance of partnerships. Amanda mentioned the state actors who were involved, the state level leaders, the state agencies. We had steering committees advising the work with opinion leaders and policymakers. But really the magic happens when the 2 institutions work together and improve their support together for transfer students. So while we're calling out partnerships in this particular section, it's really going to keep coming up throughout our conversation. And it starts with, of course, using data and looking at, and I'll spend some more time looking at talking about data, but using it to select the pathways, to understand outcomes for students, to review and tackle gaps in outcomes and strive to bring parity in those outcomes, and also analyze the success of the support and the services that institutions are providing. Institutional leaders selected their transfer experts and their partners and their core team, and we realized that partnerships were germane within an institution as well as between institutions. And in Illinois, as Amanda mentioned, we had in Virginia, we had state level leaders helping facilitate and coordinate the work and advocate for policy and practice changes. And we're going to spend the majority of today really focusing on the role of the institution. That's really where support for transfer students happens on the ground, but wanted to really recognize that there are policies in place that state leaders have developed that are really critical and are evidence-based and improve efficiency and transparency, reliability, and affordability for students. We have examples of that in Illinois. State policies that serve as building blocks include truth in tuition, where students can anticipate the same tuition charge throughout their tenure, the MAP grant, the Aim High Pilot Scholarship, the Common Application, and the Transfer Articulation Initiative. And in fact, Illinois just recently passed legislation to ensure acceptance of credits across 18 additional majors. And in Virginia, there is a statewide transfer scholarship, a statewide transfer portal that the state agency manages and keeps up to date in partnership with institutions. And again, strong state financial aid, including the G3 program, which is for community college students who are pursuing high demand fields. And the conversations in Virginia in TransferBOOST actually led to a proposal, a legislative proposal to expand G3 to include transfer pathways. That proposal didn't happen to pass, but the energy and excitement to expand affordability for transfer students was apparent. We also had examples of not only state level leadership, but institutional leadership and commitment to transfer student success as being absolutely imperative. We noticed that the questions that folks asked as they signed up for this session included the importance of buy-in. And we know when institutional leaders are really committed to transfer student success, then it shows up in those strategic enrollment plans, in metrics, and in performance evaluation across the institution. And again, starting with data to help create buy-in and tell that transfer student story, and really allowing others to understand their role in transfer, even if transfer is not in their title. We have several examples of this where transfer champions created avenues to share information across the campus about the importance of transfer students. JMU in Virginia met with other academic departments to talk about the transfer student pipelines. Northern Arizona and Maricopa created a Price is Right activity to really help their colleagues understand affordability for transfer students. NAU also created a report when there was turnover in leadership to make sure that the new leader really understands the work that had been going on, the data and the plans for the future to ensure continuity as well. Moving to our second P, pathways. TransferBOOST initially anticipated that the partners would select one or a small number of pathways to test new strategies related to improving and communicating affordability. In some cases, some partners selected quite a few pathways and even went all in and statewide. But we initially started with high value pathways that would provide an opportunity to bring parity in outcomes among underrepresented populations, our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous learners, low-income students, and adult learners. We have to start with the importance of data. It really impacted everything we did related to analyzing affordability, thinking about outreach and marketing, key populations, et cetera. So starting with the pathways, asking questions about what fields are competitive and in demand in certain regions or statewide? What is the starting wage of graduates? What transfer pathways are leading to those fields? And which students are enrolling and which students are missing or dropping out of our pipelines? And are students successfully completing both the associate's degree and the bachelor's degree? And this third piece is really including the transfer student voice and understanding their experiences with our transfer student supports, our marketing, our outreach, et cetera. We didn't go as far as we wanted to in that third piece, but we continue to keep it in the framework as it is so critical. We being the facilitated aspect of the partnership, and the work continues on each campus. Amanda will be sharing a data template and resources for you, and it includes variables that can be evaluated across the typical pipeline with a deeper analysis than might be typical related to affordability, but also, again, analyzing the advising, supports, et cetera, and the postgraduate outcomes. And for every area within the data pipeline, disaggregating by a subpopulation, by Pell eligibility, by age. And this is done for individual pathways. As we think about how we use data to address equity, it started with really big picture and setting a goal. And then it sounds easy to pull the data that I just shared. But as you likely know, understanding the keepers of data and a consistent method to gather that data, to continually evaluate it and use it to drive and inform actions, not only in selecting the pathway, but in everything, and in reaching students and considering outreach strategies, and considering affordability, and considering partnerships to strengthen advising, always bringing the equity conversation and the data back to the fore to make sure that there is intentionality as the improvements are implemented. We have several examples where institutions use that data and the information about the demand in the state to really think about and develop new pathways and articulation agreements for more technical associate's degrees. So we have examples of that in both Illinois and Virginia, where that initial applied degree was articulated to make sure that students will be efficient and understand how to get to the baccalaureate degree in short order and continue along and advance in that particular industry and pathway. So moving to the subject of affordability, we know that transfer pathways are inherently a more affordable pathway for students by starting at a lower cost institution. But TransferBOOST, really, we wanted to explore how partners can think creatively about affordability for transfer students, and how are transfer students financing their programs? What perceptions do they have about affordability, particularly when they're inquiring? What levers do institutions have to improve affordability? And how can they get the clear information in the students' hands early in their journey? So we started by engaging RPK Group to help us think about the return on investment specific to transfer students. And while we were thinking about affordability from the student's perspective, we know we need to think about it from the institution's perspective, so that you have the financial projections that are needed before you can consider or commit to dedicating resources to improve affordability for transfer students. So Katie Hagan from RPK Group created a robust tool that we're going to show and share with you today. And I'm just going to pop into the tool and give you a quick demonstration of how it works. So the tool starts with a cover page, instructions, talks about getting your team together to really reflect on your transfer student pipeline. That really is critical. The return on investment projections are influenced first and foremost by your assumptions on how many new students will be enrolling in this particular pathway, and how many students will continue to be retained, and any improvements you anticipate in retention and persistence. And then we'll walk through expenses and revenue to then predict the return on investment. This is a tool that can be used really for a lot of different initiatives across the institution, but of course was designed specifically for transfer students. So the green cells are the cells that you would enter information in. And whoops, I just, you still able to see it? Great.
Yep.
So I'm going to assume that for this particular institution, that we're starting with one pathway, and we're going to start a little bit slowly and assume that we have perhaps 20 or 10, say, new students in the first year in this pathway, and it will grow by 5 students each year, and reaching 25 or 30 new students. This does not include the students who are already enrolled in this particular pathway. We'll assume that the students are going to enroll for 12 credits on average, and we'll continue that into the second year. And then we will assume that the tuition rate for the institution is about $200 per credit with some additional fees. So it just gives you an idea of how that tuition and fee revenue is beginning to add up for that student population, and you can see the revenue across the bottom. When it comes to expenses, you can use this tool to really analyze the entire fiscal picture of serving transfer students on your campus. But you want to use caution about adding personnel into this tab unless you are hiring someone new. And we know that there is that tipping point when you're adding new students or a new program that you will need to hire faculty, advisors, etc. But in order to anticipate ROI, if you already are assuming that that your advisor, staffing, etc., will remain unchanged, then you would not add their expenses unless it is new. Then you have, and continue to increase the visibility here. Then you have the other expenses that you might have. I can type in, for example, some perhaps marketing expenses that might be required for promotion. And you can see the details that are encouraged and provided for in this tab. Each state is different. Each institution is different in terms of how you account for public institutions funding that you receive from the state. But the complexities of those conversations are allowed for in this particular tool. So just with my marketing expenses, you can see that those students for this institution are showing more than $2,000 per enrollment in an anticipated revenue. And I wanted to also show you the assumptions page, which you can change, which allows for tuition increases and other assumptions that impact the results. We have several examples of using the fiscal analysis to then consider how an institution may direct some of those anticipated resources for transfer students. And that includes committing resources for scholarships. And we have several examples where an institution decided to make scholarships more accessible. In some cases, the institution dedicated the funding in the anticipated revenue, as we just showed. In other cases, they collaborated with their foundation to dedicate a scholarship for transfer students. Several institutions evaluated the grade point average that is required for the transfer scholarship, lowered that a little bit, and worked on promoting the scholarship early in the process. There was the realization that transfer students are aware of the scholarship once they receive it, which is great for a streamlined application process, but it's not early enough to really impact decision-making for students. And the next P and our final P in the 4 Ps is promotion. And that is getting on the tallest mountaintop to share with prospective and current students about the benefits of getting on and staying on a transfer pathway. Institutions are very creative in your marketing efforts, including pathway-specific promotion. And when institutions work together, it can really function almost as a dual admission program and really amplify the end goal for students early in their community college career. We worked with a communications firm, Kinetic Seeds, who facilitated brainstorming with each partnership on key benefits of or messages for students. But we also looked at benefits for the institution and even the state to help with the buy-in and advocacy as well. This is an example of how the messaging framework began to take form. And in Illinois, 2 institutions provided a joint letter from the presidents of each institution. And each partnership received a messaging framework to guide their efforts. And this is an area where partnerships began to also talk about outreach strategies. How do we approach high school students when both institutions are recruiting high school students? How should we think about our adult learners in the community and make sure that we're recruiting into the pathway and not only focused on the important work of supporting current community college students as they consider transferring. And in Arizona, there are several transfer-focused initiatives. So in their case, they did not brand the initiative as TransferBOOST, which is completely fine to avoid brand confusion. And the two institutions worked together to create a joint email that went to enrolled Maricopa students. And then this is an example of a revised brochure. The example of the email is also in the resources that Amanda will share with you now.
Great, thank you, Rochelle. So what did we release? There was a lot of learning that happened, a lot of takeaways, and we really just sort of scratched the surface as part of this presentation. So we aim to distill insights from the TransferBOOST initiative into a 3-part series that includes actionable recommendations for community colleges, 4-year colleges, and state higher education leaders. We also wanted to provide some resources, tools that we developed as part of this initiative that might be helpful to folks who are on the ground and working in the transfer space day to day and considering setting up these kinds of partnerships. So the first brief in the series shares lessons learned for higher education policymakers and practitioners from the initiative, a lot of the 4 Ps that we talked about today. And in the appendix, there are a couple of tools that Rochelle mentioned that can be used by anyone working in the transfer space. The first is the messaging framework to help folks construct clear messages about transfer pathways and some considerations for developing those messages. And then next is some sample language for joint recruitment between institutions, because again, the partnership is an incredibly important facet of these pathways. And so aligning that language is helpful to both the institutions who are participating, but also incredibly important to the students who are on the receiving end of those messages. Our next brief is boosting transfer partnerships to promote equitable and affordable transfer pathways. And so I feel like we're doubling down on this message, but partnerships are really at the center of the work that happened. We wouldn't have been able to do the financial modeling, to do the communications work, had we not had really strong partnerships, both on the campus, between campuses, and with state higher ed leaders. And that's really what drove this work. So this brief showcases some takeaways from the initiative and key steps in developing these partnerships, which include selecting state and institutional partners and advisory committee members, conducting a policy scan to strengthen the design of transfer efforts, examining institutional and partnership data, and setting clear goals that align with specific institutional and state contexts. So this one also includes some tools in the appendix that can be used to support these kinds of partnerships. The first are a series of checklists for both states and then a separate set for institutions to understand what policies are currently in place and how they may or may not have an equity lens. So where are you in the pathway? And how do we understand the policies and practices that are in place and the ways in which they either support or maybe hinder some of the transfer work that we are striving to do? The next appendix is around guidance on data collection that Rochelle mentioned toward the beginning of the presentation. This outlines what data can and should be collected by different partners at different points in the process to understand who's being served by the pathways and support continuous improvement of the pathways. And then our third brief is boosting transfer pathways through strategic finance and affordability. And this outlines the steps that partnerships took and offers guidance on how institutions can use the transfer affordability financial tool that Rochelle walked through. It provides clear steps on how states can support institutions in improving transfer affordability. And so I'm not going to hash out the details of the tool since Rochelle did a great walkthrough for us, but I'll also flag that on that publications site that Emily put in the chat, there's also a a one-pager that's available that's sort of a quick takeaway, what the tool is, how you use it, if you don't have the time to dive into the report right away. But I highly recommend digging into this one to really focus on equity and affordability. So I'll take a pause there, and because that was a lot of information, and we want to open it up for some questions. I know we've had a few coming into the chat, and one, Rochelle, I'm really curious your take. An anonymous attendee noted that it's common practice at their institution for the four-year partners to dictate the terms of articulation agreements and hesitate to commit to include any concrete supports beyond credit transfer for community college students. So is this something that you saw as we were facilitating conversations with institutions, and how any advice for how they might navigate those conversations?
Yes, that's a great question. And one idea would be to keep the minimum information in that formal agreement that you're both held accountable to, but try to go beyond that and test other things that you can do to work together and kind of work out the kinks, and then go back and add those to an MOU or mutual agreement that you're both striving for the same goals. And so really think about beyond the acceptance of credit, the things that we talked about today. How can we market together? How can we target the populations that we're trying to serve together? How can we really think of this as a seamless pathway, and for students, put the student at the center, and then what is our role to work together to make that happen? But that would be my suggestion, is to if you put too much in a formal agreement out of the gate, it might be better to commit to that and then work on that and then enter it into the agreement. There's another question, Amanda, regarding prior learning assessment and participating institutions, and there's reference to acceptance of all transfer credits. Another area I think that the state can play an important role to establish some consistency and parameters for equitable treatment of PLA across institutions, particularly for the public institutions, and has been recognized more and more as being absolutely critical, particularly for those adult learners. I don't know if in the Degrees When Due initiative you spent a lot of time on PLA, but that certainly came up in Arizona as being a critical policy.
That's something that some of our Degrees When Due states have explored. It wasn't a central part of our engagement with them as part of the Degrees When Due initiative, but it's definitely something that states are grappling with, and really, I think to your point, Rochelle, play a really key role in setting some standards.
Right. There's another question about data regarding Native versus transfer students and scholarships. That's an interesting analysis. In this particular project, that was not explored. I think that would be interesting to really dive into that affordability and analyze transfer students, but then compare them as similarly situated, economically speaking, students, Native versus transfer students. Internal stakeholders are essential. Do you see validity where transfer should be housed institutionally and staff? I'm sorry, it keeps moving every time someone asks a question. Staffing ratio to the number of full-time students, not enough staffing for transfer. It does seem like when you get leadership, engagement, and buy-in and commitment, where transfer students are called out in strategic planning, that staffing should flow, theoretically speaking, following the goals of a strategic plan. And the ROI tool that we shared could help with the case making there as well.
And Rochelle, there's a question here on seeing some great examples of partnerships across 2 institutions and wondering if we have recommendations for statewide partnerships or examples where a single community college might be a feeder to multiple institutions. And I'll just say that our state agencies, particularly in Illinois and Virginia, were incredibly important partners for bringing folks to the table, for getting folks sort of on the same page, and for maintaining that consistency. And so where the higher ed agency in your state can play a role where you can engage them in these conversations, I think they played an incredibly important role in both sort of facilitating conversations, but also I think keeping energy up because they've also, Illinois and Virginia have been pretty active in this even since we wrapped up this pilot. But Rochelle, curious your thoughts.
Yeah, that question reminds me of Southern Illinois University Carbondale that said that was one institution that said we work with all of our community college partners across the state. And so we want to really participate in TransferBOOST, but think about it statewide. Another interesting aspect was the 4-year institutions that were partnering with multiple community colleges would gather as a team with everybody. And so that sharing with, the bigger the team, the more ideas there are, was really helpful. And so there was some statewide solutions within TransferBOOST, even though most of it was 2 partners together. We didn't need data sharing agreements for the aspect that we facilitated, as it was the broad numbers and not record level. And an improvement to that would be to have more record level sharing, monitoring outcomes as individual students go through the pathway. And there would likely need to be an agreement for that.
There's a great question here, Rochelle. I think, and you touched on this briefly, so I'm curious if you have additional insights on how to encourage collaboration between universities when working on these sort of statewide transfer partnerships, when they're in some cases competing for the same student population. I know this was a point of conversation, particularly around students coming just out of high school. And so curious if you have some thoughts there you could share.
It is a great question. It is easier to recruit students who are in the educational pipeline, right? Whether it's a high school student or a community college student that we're recruiting to transfer on. And when we recognize that both 2- and 4-year institutions are recruiting high school students, it can get a little sticky there on occasion. And that came up, and we talked about it, and certainly everyone was professional and talked about how we talk about transfer pathways when we're talking to high school students who indicate either that they intend to go to the community college or they intend to pursue a particular pathway. That said, there were not perfect examples of joint that I saw of joint recruitment of current high school students. That did allow us, however, to go into this conversation about adult learners that is so important, and defining adults very broadly. That includes your high school graduates of 1, 2, 3 years ago who did not go directly to post-secondary. And we leveraged degrees when due and national partners to think about partnerships, community-based partnerships and employers, and creative marketing methods to get to the adult learners. And that was an area that the joint recruitment came together very, very nicely.
Great. So there's a question here about turnover. And I know this is something that we experienced as part of TransferBOOST. And they noted that due to high turnover, all efforts in the past year to keep the connection have dwindled. So are there any strategies that we've seen to help get their attention and maintain the partnership so students are successful?
That seems to be an ongoing challenge, and especially in the great resignation, quiet quitting, whatever, however you want to describe it. And it's also a challenge at a time when enrollments are dwindling and therefore budgets are constrained. And yet you need more resources to serve students well. And I think turnover is a part of that, of those challenges to keep something new going and to keep the pedal on the metal. I can't help but say, continue to use the data and the student story. The adage behind every statistic is a story. The more you can do to get the student story and the data for case making, for the staffing, for the engaging transfer more intentionally in strategic planning, and all of that, which can help with turnover. Sometimes it's hard. You feel like you're starting over. That did happen with one institution where there was quite a bit of turnover in leadership. And so it was sort of wash, rinse, repeat. And thankfully, that we're able to keep going with it.
Looking at some of these other questions, Rochelle, did you find that any of the partnerships are sort of 2+2 linear transfers, or was co-enrollment part of any of the transfer partnerships from your experience?
It was more of a linear. There were some discussions about co-enrollment and even dual admission, but those were already existing initiatives by the partner institutions. But lended to offering community college students resources at the four-year college. Come use our library, come to our activities, etc. But there was it was not intentionally a co-enrollment. It was more of a 2+2, and a lot of interest in completion of the associate's degree prior to transferring as well.
Great.
There's a comment about transfer retention, because a lot of what we're talking about is recruiting students into the community college pathway and through and into the four-year pathway. And retention certainly came up, and I would say TransferBOOST, Amanda shared the 4 tenets that we were focused on. There were some nice surprises, I would say, that the partners, because they were at the table, they ended up doing faculty meet and greets and things that were not an anticipated part of the project, but ended up coming out of when you meet together and start planning together, then the joint advising improvements happen. In fact, even I'm remembering newly created dedicated transfer advising positions were created, and that coordination and joint advising can help with the retention, the affordability piece. The scholarships can help with retention as well. And then that using the data and evaluating the student experience can lead to improvements in those areas as well.
Great. And we've got a couple of questions here that touch on, I think, to what you were just speaking about, Rochelle, advising, technology, common applications. So were things like shared advising technology in addition to sort of those joint advisors, or a common application among participants? Were those some things that we saw during TransferBOOST?
Well, when I think of technology, I can't help but speak again to Virginia's transfer portal. Very well done, very user-friendly portal for students. And in terms of shared advising technology, I didn't personally see that. I do know Governor State created for their team, I believe it was an internal tool, but an ability to identify, monitor, track, support TransferBOOST participants. And the application system was integrated into their technology that they use on their campus. but I don't know that that was shared with the community colleges. I believe it was within that institution. So more student-facing tools is what I saw in this particular project. Thank you, Emily, for sharing the portal.
Great, and there are a couple of comments in here about Illinois using transferology.
Right, thank you. And there was, and I remember this question on the set of questions too, we happen to work with public institutions in this initiative, but could easily see the participation of transfer students who provide critical path, private institutions who provide critical pathways for transfer students, often very affordable pathways. And so really just identifying what the pathways are, how you're going to talk about affordability, how you're going to communicate with students about it, and expanding options and choice for students could easily be done in partnership with the state agencies as well.
And there's a question here about course sequencing and some folks who have that associate's degree from the community college maybe having a hard time once they get to the four-year institution because of sequencing and maybe overwhelmed by a schedule with too many difficult courses at once. Because a lot of the pathways were the linear, the 2+2, are there any examples that come to mind about how institutions might have addressed this?
I think NAU, number one, institutions have sequencing and mapped pathways that already existed, and then the TransferBOOST in some institutions focused on affordability and strengthening marketing and communications for articulated pathways and sequencing that already existed. But I also think of the 3-year pathway at NAU, between NAU and Maricopa, that is a mapped pathway that just allows a student to remain at the community college for 3 years and complete their bachelor's degree in 1 year. So it was an interesting model. The sequencing and the consistency, flexibility, reliability, managing your work schedule around that is an example of a great retention practice. And it was a little out of scope of the details that we focused on in this particular project.
And I'll just quickly say that from a different initiative that IHEP led, Degrees When Due, that the flexibility, paying attention to where some of those course conflicts, where students may be experiencing those, that's another place where, to bring it back to data, the assessment and reassessment of your data where folks may be running into challenges is incredibly important. And so investing time and capacity to address some of those data challenges is really important in, I think, sort of broadly, but particularly in the transfer student and the adult learner context.
That's an example of something I think when you get together as partners and you're looking at the data and you say, I wonder what some of the obstacles are, and you survey transfer students, and you know, because you have transfer advisors at the table, that the sequencing and the availability that are on different schedules depending on the 2 and the 4-year can be identified and discussed and addressed and brought to leadership throughout that partnership process.
And I know we are just about at time, and had one last question here about recommendations for reviewing articulation agreements, because having that common understanding, that common course articulation is super important for these kinds of partnerships. So Rochelle wondered if you had any thoughts on timing for review.
Most articulation agreements were in place before TransferBOOST, and there were some that were created. We mentioned the applied degrees that were created. I think what's important is continuing to evaluate student success in the pathway. the frequency of updating the agreement should be driven by changes that need to be made because you're reviewing the data from my perspective. So, so setting an update schedule that feels comfortable with being accompanied by that analysis, not having to do it every year just because, but having a schedule that that does allow an opportunity to review, is this working? Should we expand it? Should we make some changes?
I cannot thank you both enough for the time you spent with us today to go over this amazing initiative and all of these rich insights from your work with the TransferBOOST partners. I put in the chat a link to the NISTS conference archives. A lot of these topics, retention, recruitment, communication, articulation agreements, prior learning assessment, all of those topics come up at our annual conference. It happens every February. And so I put the link to the conference archives there. You have to sort of peruse the title and use our search box, but if you're interested in one of these aspects, there's lots of insight there from your peers who are doing this work all across the country. So if you couldn't get enough information today, who can? Transfer is our favorite subject. We never stop talking about it, but there's so many more insights there on our website. So I've listed that there if you need it. Again, Rochelle and Amanda, thank you so much for joining us. We have recorded the conversation. I'm going to edit it. It's going to be an easy job, but we'll get it up on our YouTube channel and send it to all registered attendees early next week. So I just want to thank you again. I think this is such valuable learning for all involved. And even if we can't do this big of an initiative on our own, there are pieces of this that we can absolutely integrate into our daily work. And a lot of that has to do with how we interact with our students, how we communicate with them, how often we're analyzing our data. So thank you for those helpful reminders. And everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. And again, thank you to our wonderful presenters today.